About 10 days ago, I released a video in which I took an opposing stance to the popular position regarding net neutrality as articulated by Phil DeFranco. Philly D, like most popular YouTubers, celebrities, and media personalities, is strongly in favor of maintaining the Title II regulations that were put in place during the Obama administration. The FCC is considering rolling back those regulations, and it currently looks likely that they may have the votes to do so. Because I went against popular opinion and said that what Chairman Ajit Pai of the FCC has proposed may not be bad, and may even potentially be a good thing for the internet, that video has turned out to be one of my most controversial and disliked ones. Some of the comments I received were rather pointed and angry, while others expressed their dismay at how I could be so very wrong on this issue. As I've said before, I am always open to the possibility that I could be wrong on anything that I believe. I even made a video called "The Joy of Wrong" about how I appreciate it when I discover my errors, because that's how I can correct them and get better. To recognize you are wrong is to have learned something. So in this video, I'm going to very briefly outline why I have the position that I do. And then if you still disagree, please feel free to correct me and explain why in the comments. I am not emotionally invested in my position and will change my mind based on good evidence and argumentation. Okay, so with that out of the way,
let's just jump into it.
First, we need to talk a little bit about the two major US government organizations that are related to net neutrality. The first organization is the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission. The FCC makes regulations about what communication-related businesses can or cannot do. Historically, they're a pretty powerful organization. They're most well known for enforcing indecency laws. They're the guys that tried to sue CBS for over $500,000 for Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction that happened during Super Bowl 38 back in 2004. Oh, and let's not forget that Peter Griffin knows all about the FCC.
The FCC.
Oh yeah, I know all about the FCC. They will clean up all your talking in a manner such as this. They will make you take a tinkle when you want to take a piss.
And they'll make you call fellatio a trouser-friendly kiss.
Here's the plain situation. There's no negotiation with the fellas at the freaking FCC.
The second is the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission. They don't make any regulations, but instead, their job is to make sure that all businesses play fair and don't deceive their customers. They investigate claims of unfair business practices and can levy fines against violators. Those fines are then paid out, generally as refunds. Because the FTC doesn't make laws, you don't generally hear too much about them until after they've already completed a successful investigation. For example, like when they fined AT&T $80 million for mobile cramming. So in very general terms, the FCC prescribes in advance what is legal behavior via regulations. It is proactive. The FTC responds to consumer complaints and determines what is fair via investigations. It is reactive. Understanding the differences between these two government agencies is crucial to what is going on with the whole storm revolving around net neutrality. For the entire history of the internet, right up until just 2 years ago in 2015, things worked like this. ISPs provided internet service to consumers. The FCC was only lightly involved in regulating them. Meanwhile, the FTC stood by to investigate any consumer complaints that arose. Both organizations had a watchful eye as to what was going on. As the internet grew, the FCC issued ever more detailed guidelines about what it considered to be generally acceptable business practices. This period is often called the light touch phase. The internet generally grew very well under these circumstances, but with only light regulations in place, from time to time, ISPs would sometimes push the boundaries or try to do something that looked unfair or out of line. If you're following the net neutrality story much at all, you've probably seen a list like this one, produced by an organization called Free Press. This list, or one very much like it, was sent to me or reproduced in the comments in response to my last video. Now, this list of alleged net neutrality violations looks pretty scary on the surface. But if you examine it closely, you'll quickly note that it only tells you about the problems, and it doesn't tell you much about what happened after those problems were discovered. It tells you the first part of the story, but it leaves you to guess as to how those problems may have been resolved. So when you fact-check these cases, as was done in an article by High Tech Forum, you discover that the mere threat of the FCC or the FTC getting involved was often enough to get things back on track. In the interest of time, I'm not going to step through all of them case by case, but I'll leave a link in the notes so that you can check them out for yourself. The High Tech Forum article concludes that most alleged net neutrality violations didn't happen, were quickly resolved, or were outside the FCC's jurisdiction. In 2010, and in response to growing questions about what the FCC's role should be in regulating the internet, the FCC released a list of 6 guidelines. This was called the Open Internet Order. These guidelines are what most people think of when they talk about net neutrality. Here they are from the Wikipedia article about net neutrality in the US. Now, I generally agree with these principles, especially the first 3, usually summarized as transparency, no blocking, and no fast lanes, as I imagine most people do. So, what's the problem? Aren't we all on the same page here? This is where, I think, the confusion over Title II net neutrality begins. You see, in 2014, there was a landmark court case called Verizon Communications versus the FCC. The outcome of this case was that the court ruled that, under the current structure, the FCC could only enforce one of the 3 big guidelines, the transparency one. The other 2 were something that ISPs could voluntarily agree to do, and then if they did not, the FTC could investigate them for fraud, but the FCC had no authority to pre-regulate those guidelines. Regulating and enforcing the no blocking and the no fast lanes could only apply to ISPs if they were reclassified to be telecommunication services under Title II and therefore brought under the sole jurisdiction of the FCC, rather than stay as they had been classified for roughly the past 20 years as information services. Well, this ruling made President Obama angry. As he often did, President Obama took the attitude of government knows best, and so he instructed the FCC to figure out how to legally justify changing the classifications of the ISPs from being Title I, as they currently were, to being Title II, where the FCC could be in total control of them. And so they did. They put together a big 400-page document describing why they felt they were right to change how the ISPs were classified. A link to that document is below. And then they held an internal vote on it, and the new regulations passed by a vote of 3-2 in February of 2015. This new classification changed how all the pieces fit together. Under the new Title II regulations, the FTC was removed from its position. Bye-bye. And the FCC was now moved to act as an intercessory between consumers and ISPs. Anything that ISPs now did would have to be reviewed and approved by the FCC. At the time of the change from Title I to Title II, 2 guys voted against it and wrote their dissenting opinions as part of that 400-page new book of regulations. They both said pretty much the same thing. The current system, with the FCC and the FTC watching over things, was working pretty well. Sure, there were sometimes issues, but for the past 20 years, they had been able to stay on top of them. Now, with the FCC essentially becoming the lord of the internet, and all the new red tape that it would bring, it would likely slow down innovation and infrastructure involvement in the short term, and who knows what new regulations it might decide to impose in the long term. Remember, we're talking about the freaking FCC now being the new boss of the internet.
I am the law!
Well, Donald Trump got elected in 2016 and the FCC got reorganized. Dissenting voice Ajit Pai became the chairman, and he quickly began advocating for a repeal of the Obama-era Title II reclassification. Commissioner Pai claims that the Title II regulations have, indeed, caused a reduction in both infrastructure growth and that they have made it harder for smaller ISPs to compete because they don't have the resources to push their way through all the new FCC regulations. And that's essentially where we are today. Now, a lot of the arguments regarding the proposed repeal of the Title II regulations makes it sound like the FCC is considering doing something totally ridiculous that has never been done before. They act like this is the end of the internet as we know it. That is not at all correct. All that Pai has proposed is a return to how government oversight worked just a couple of years ago, but with one very important difference. Remember when I said earlier that the 2014 ruling upheld the regulation for transparency? That piece would still be in effect. This means that the FTC could now play an even greater role in keeping an eye on business practices. Maureen K. Olhausen, the acting chairman of the FTC, explained how this additional transparency will give them even more power to advocate and protect consumers from any sneaky or underhanded things that ISPs might try. Here is a key piece of what she wrote. The FTC uses its Consumer Protection Authority to ensure that consumers get the benefit of the bargain they strike. As the DC Circuit has explained, the very core of net neutrality is ensuring that broadband providers fulfill the reasonable expectations of broadband customers. The FTC's Deception and Unfairness Authority are well suited to this task. If a broadband provider makes a public commitment to certain neutral practices but breaks that promise, the FTC could bring a deception case. And if consumers generally expect that broadband services offer connections to all parts of the internet without blocking or throttling, but a provider blocks or throttles certain sites without disclosing this practice, the FTC could bring a deceptive omission case. So, it seems very unlikely to me that the repeal of Title II will mean that ISPs suddenly turn into out-of-control monsters who are charging you for every little thing you want to do, while simultaneously blocking and throttling anything they deem competitive to their interests. Not only will consumers not stand for it, but history has shown that even under Title I, neither will the FCC nor the FTC. The advantages of returning to Title I regulation means that ISPs will now have additional freedom to try out new business models and partnerships without first getting permission from the FCC. Now, some have said that this is a bad thing because those greedy ISPs are just going to find new ways to charge customers for all the things that they want. But again, history shows that this hasn't been the case. Instead, ISPs have used their influence to strike deals with content providers like Netflix or Hulu as a way to entice customers to come over to where their support of those things are better than are their competitors. Now, I could be wrong about all this, and you may say that my confidence in the market and the ISPs is naive. And you may be right. But if we do wind up in this hypothetical worst-case internet dystopia that so many seem so deathly afraid of, the FCC can simply reverse its decision yet again and bring everything back under Title II regulation. We already know that the ISPs don't like that, so there's yet another reason to think that they'll try to play nice. On the other hand, if you're in favor of the Title II regulations, have you spent any time considering the potential dangers of continuing to have the FCC in charge of all internet service providers? There are potential bad things that can happen here too, you know. For example, rather than trying out new business models with their customers, ISPs could just hire a bunch of lobbyists and work to get regulatory exceptions for their new business models passed through the FCC. And as a consumer, you wouldn't even know what they're up to. Even worse, when all network roads lead straight through the FCC, have you considered how they might decide to block what you can see or hear? They do have a history of that, you know. At least with an ISP, you can file a complaint or potentially move on to another ISP. But when it's the FCC running the whole show, What are you going to do now? The UN decides it wants to stop so-called harassment by passing every Twitter message through a filter first? Presto! The FCC is there and ready to make sure all ISPs in the country abide the new UN ruling. A new FCC panel turns out to be headed by a sex-negative feminist, and so decides that some of those Japanese websites you like to visit are too misogynist for her tastes? Bam! They're all shut down overnight. A new Congress comes in and decides to outlaw Bitcoin trading? Poof! Your ISP, no matter who it is suddenly forbidden from allowing you to access trading sites. And in each of these hypothetical scenarios, there's nothing you can do. So, still think the FCC is your friend in net neutrality?
They may just be neurotic or possibly psychotic. They're the fellas at the freaking FCC.
Alright, so that's a bit of clarification on my position regarding Title II net neutrality. Please share with me your thoughts in the comments below.